Well, hey everybody, thanks for tuning in today. I'm really excited about this week and what we're launching into because we're going to spend the next 2 months studying one of the most looming figures in the Bible. We're going to roll up our sleeves and dive into the life of David from the Bible. We're going to become Davidologists. We're going to go to David University together. And let me tell you why we're doing this and why this is worth doing. Why is it that we're going to take the bulk of the summer months and devote so much time to studying one guy's life? Well, for one thing, David was a remarkable man. One scholar said if he had to name a single Renaissance man in human history, like somebody with extraordinary, capabilities on multiple fronts, David, he said, very possibly would be at the top of the list for all time and for all humanity. That's a lot of territory right there. But you think about it though, he was a musician so skilled that another king, King Saul, would summon David to play in his presence because David's playing would vanish depression when nothing else would. It was like musical Prozac for Saul. He was such a formidable warrior that he won a legendary battle against a giant of a champion when he wasn't even old enough to shave. He attracted the greatest soldiers of his people in his day to serve under him, and he subjugated his nation's enemies in a way that the nation of Israel had never experienced before in their history and would never experience again. He was a fierce, courageous competitor. Like he'd take on a lion, he'd take on a bear, anything. He'd take them all on. And then he was a poet too. I mean, he wrote the Psalms that express the longings of the human heart for God so deeply that today, in our day, thousands of years later, they remain the single most moving and influential devotional literature ever written. David essentially wrote the bulk of the prayer book for the human race. He was also a statesman. He was a statesman of such wisdom and political skill that Israel achieved its highest level of economic well-being and political stability in its history under his reign. I mean, his reign would forever be remembered as the golden age of Israel, kind of like their Camelot, you know. And it would exist so powerfully in people's memories that they would refer to the great awaited king to come, the chosen one, the Messiah, the Savior. They would refer to him as the Son of David, because they hoped that he would reclaim the glory of the days of David. He was also an attractive person. We're told several times he was attractive physically and in his personality, that men and women were drawn to his charismatic presence. He was just this magnetic figure. I mean, think about this one guy. He had the poetic soul of Shakespeare and the competitive heart of Michael Jordan and the musicianship of Beethoven and the statesmanship of Lincoln and the physical attractiveness of Brad Pitt, you know. He was a remarkable guy. In many ways, he was the central character of the Old Testament. I mean, think about just the space that's devoted to him. For instance, Abraham had 16 chapters in the Old Testament devoted to his story. Same thing with Joseph. Elijah got 10 chapters devoted to his story. But David has about 66 chapters in the Bible devoted to him. He's mentioned like 600 times or so in the Old Testament and another 60 times in the New Testament. I mean, so bright is his memory, he's the last character named in the Bible. In Revelation 22:16, Jesus says, I am the offspring of David, the morning star. I mean, to this day, the flag that flies over Israel features the Star of David. He was a charismatic, remarkable man. But in the verses we're going to look at today, to kind of get this David party started, God says that what's really remarkable about David, what drew God to him, was not his external accomplishments at all. It was his heart. And I'll tell you a secret. I mean, I have a secret to tell you. Not only am I not left-handed, but my real reason, our real reason for studying David is what I think God will do to our hearts, your heart, my heart, over these summer months. I think this is going to be a heart deal. And I think we're going to learn a lot. And I think our hearts will have an opportunity to change into hearts that belong more and more and more to God. So, if you got a Bible, get to the book of 1 Samuel. The 16th chapter of 1 Samuel is where we first meet David in the Bible. And at this point in time, you know, Israel had been freed from slavery in Egypt. They had lived in the promised land under a series of judges like Joshua and Gideon and Samson. You've probably heard of Samson before. And the last judge that led Israel was named Samuel. But the people, they wanted a king. They looked around and they saw all the other nations had a king, and they wanted one too. Even though God said, listen, you don't need a king, you got me. You know, but they insisted, and God gave them what they wanted. And so God had Samuel anoint a king. And the first king that was anointed was Saul. And he was an impressive physical man. I mean, physically imposing. He stood head and shoulders over the people of Israel. That's mainly why he was chosen. But Saul became increasingly corrupt and violent and evil. And God said in 1 Samuel 13 that he had appointed a new man to be king. And this man was a man after his own heart. God had kind of turned the page from Saul, and he had appointed a man after his own heart. And now in 1 Samuel 16, Samuel's an old man at this time, and we read his story from when he was a little kid that God spoke to him in the temple, and now he's an old man, and this time, he's almost done on this earth. And God speaks to him, one more time speaks to him in 1 Samuel 16. And here's what we read. Check it out. The Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I've chosen one of his sons to be king. But Samuel said, how can I go? I mean, Saul will hear about it and kill me. The Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice and I'll show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate. So Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, do you come in peace? Samuel replied, yes, in peace. I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. So consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me. And then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things humans look at. Human beings look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. Jesse then had Shammah pass by, but Samuel said, nor has the Lord chosen this one. Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? They're still the youngest, Jesse answered, but he's tending the sheep. Samuel said, send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. So he sent and had him brought in. He was ruddy with a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. He is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power. And Samuel went to Ramah. All right. So here's what happens. God tells Samuel, Samuel, I want you to go and I want you to anoint a new king. And Samuel says, but God, we've already got a king. And if Saul hears that I'm going to anoint a new king, he's going to go nuts. And more than that, God, the road that leads from where I am in Ramah to where David lives in Bethlehem, it goes right through Gibeah where Saul's home is. I got to go right through the hornet's nest to do what you're asking me to do. And God said, I don't need a geography lesson. Just trust me. And so Samuel goes to this little obscure village of Bethlehem there. And you may have noticed there that the Bible says in verse 4 that the elders of the town trembled when Samuel was coming. Like Samuel wasn't known for his small talk. And they wondered, whoa, what's going on? Somebody must have messed up. They must be in serious trouble. That's why Samuel's here. That's what they think. And so they trembled. They were scared. And Samuel says, relax, man. It's okay. God's going to give a great honor to this town because the leader of God's people is going to come from Bethlehem. So Samuel invites the elders and Jesse's family to this event. And you could imagine that his arrival would create quite a stir throughout this, obscure little village of Bethlehem. And Jesse, of course, is so proud he can hardly stand it. And we got to picture this scene that we just read about. Jesse introduces his first son, his heir. And he's always known his first kid was destined for greatness. Like he was class president. He was a quarterback of the football team. He graduated first in his class, got into an Ivy League school, became an outstanding young CEO. So this first kid, he pulls up in a Tesla and he has a commanding presence. He walks into a room and he just dominates it. And Jesse says, this is my son Eliab. Eliab is Hebrew for, you're the man. Not really, I just made that up. But here's his impressive oldest son Eliab. And Jesse says, yes, he's the man. And all the elders nod their heads and say, yes, he's the man. And Samuel looks at him and says, yep, he's the man, all right. But God says, he's not the man. So Samuel passes that word on. And then Jesse has son number 2, Abinadab. And he's not the man either. And then son number 3, Shammah. He's not the man. And he goes through all 7 sons, and they don't all get named, but they all, one by one, are paraded before Samuel, and nobody is the man. And Samuel's wondering, God, why in the world did you have me come into the middle of nowhere to reject 7 sons? So he turns to Jesse and he says to Jesse, are these the only sons you have? Which seems like a silly question, I mean, Jesse should be aware of how many sons he has. Are these the only sons you have? And Jesse says, almost as an afterthought, he says, well, they're still the youngest, And at this point, we still don't even get a name. We just get, Jesse saying, well, what's his face? The youngest son. What's his name? The youngest? They're still the youngest, Jesse says. Now we need to understand that in the language that this was written in the Hebrew language, the term the youngest, it meant not merely the youngest born, the last born. It also meant the lowest in rank. There's a real big significance in that day to the whole birth order thing. Now there's some of that in our day too. I mean, I don't know how many of you were not the firstborn in your family, but you may have noticed before that the firstborn can sometimes have certain advantages, like in the photo album category, for instance. Did you ever notice this? So like Jesse's photo album was something like this. He'd say, here are the pictures of our firstborn, Eliab. Here's Eliab being born. Here's Eliab when he's 1 hour old. Here's a picture of Eliab on his second day. Here's Eliab when we were taking him home from the hospital. Here's Eliab at 2 weeks. Here's Eliab at 1 month old. Here's Eliab at 2 months old. Here's Eliab taking his first steps. Here's Eliab saying his first words. Here's Eliab, in his big boy bed. Here's Eliab taking swim lessons. Here's Eliab learning how to ride a bike, all the way down. Every moment of Eliab's life is recorded because he's the firstborn. And then there's number 2, like Abinadab. Here's Abinadab being born. Here's Abinadab going to preschool. Here's Abinadab on his first day of kindergarten. Here's Abinadab in middle school, and on and on. And then there's son number 3, Here's Shammah being born. Here's Shammah going to first grade. Here's Shammah graduated from high school. You get down to the last photo album and you open it up and they say, well, here's David being born. I mean, is that David? Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's David. We got to get more pictures of David. That's the only one they got. I'm actually the youngest of 3 sons, not 8, but 3. And there was no photo album of me. There was a photo album for my oldest brother, Tim. He got one. And my other brother, Jamie, the middle child, he got one. I didn't get one, the youngest. Actually, in a moment of sweet redemption, though, my oldest brother, Tim's photo album, there was a place for you to write mother's first words and father's first words, like when they first laid eyes on their firstborn. And a few days after my brother Tim was born, my mom was filling that book out. And so she turned to my dad and said, what were your first words when you saw Tim? And my dad said, and I'm not making this up, he said, that's the ugliest baby I've ever seen, which is great enough. But then my dad said to my mom, what were your first words? And my mom said, he looks just like his father. It's a little sweet redemption right there. Anyway, Jesse says, there's still the youngest, but he's out with the sheep. I'd show you a picture, but we don't have any of him. But he's not the man, Samuel. And Samuel says, go send for him anyway, and we'll wait. Now you imagine what that was like. I mean, that had to take considerable time to track this kid down out with the sheep somewhere. So Samuel says, hey, we're not going to sit down until he comes. And so they're just all standing around, all these brothers, these 7 sons, all like the first runner-up in the Miss America pageant, trying to look like things are okay when they're really hoping they won't find David, and Samuel will have to choose one of them. Eventually, though, they tracked down David. They used the Life app or the ancient version of Find My iPhone, and voila, David rolls in, still smelly and stinky from being in the fields with the sheep. And God looks at David, and God says, that's the one. That's the man. That's him. Now, there's this theme going on here, and it kind of runs throughout the entire Old Testament. And it's important to notice it and understand a little bit about it. And it has to do with the reversal of this birth order thing. Because again, in those days, the birth order, it was a big, big deal. I mean, think about the thread that's followed in the Old Testament of the people of God. For instance, Ishmael is born first, but God chooses Isaac. Esau comes first, but God has the line go through Jacob. 10 brothers are born first, but God chooses Joseph. And here in 1 Samuel 16, 7 other boys are born first. But David, the youngest, well, he's the one who becomes king. Now, what's God saying? What's God trying to tell us? Is God saying that firstborn kids are all spoiled brats and he likes middle or younger kids better? Yes, that's part of what he's saying. No, I'm kidding. All right. That's not what it's about. All right. Anyway, in those days, everything went to the firstborn. All rights, all property, all privileges. And there's a big fancy word for it called primogeniture. And that's the way the power structures went back then. And God is saying that he's breaking into the ordinary cultural practices of human life. He's doing a new thing. And now old limitations and old boundaries about who counts and who doesn't count, they just don't apply anymore. Not in God's kingdom. God is doing something new, and he's not bound or beholden to any human system or powers. God is at work now, and his kingdom is going to shake some things up. God summarizes this in verse 7 where he says to Samuel, human beings consider outward appearances, but I look at the heart. God looks at the heart. And that doesn't mean that giftedness or talents or strengths, they don't matter to God. I mean, not at all. God, after all, is the one who distributes gifts and talents and abilities and strengths as he sees fit, however he sees fit. And he intends for everyone to fully utilize and deploy our gifts and abilities to their fullest potential to shine gloriously for his purposes. What 1 Samuel 16:7 is pointing out is not that gifts, talents, or strengths are bad things or things God can't use. What it points out is that the human race inevitably tends to obsess over external appearances. I mean, we just tend to think that charm and attractiveness and ability that leads to outward accomplishments is the main thing that matters. So if I have those things in obvious, visible ways, then I'm blessed. That's what we think. And if I don't have them in obvious, visible ways, then I'm insignificant or I don't matter. And we just forget about the heart. We forget about the heart. And what God says over and over and over again, and what God is saying to some of us right now, is that in his kingdom, everybody matters, even the youngest son. In God's kingdom, everybody counts. In God's kingdom, everybody has something to offer. In God's kingdom, everybody's contribution matters, the lastborn as well as the firstborn. So if you take the best gifts you have, whatever they are, and if you take a heart full of devotion and you lay those gifts and you lay that heart at God's feet, then oh my goodness, look out, because that's when things get cooking. That's kingdom dynamite. God said to Samuel, the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. And that's what he found in David. Now, a good question is what makes David's heart so appealing to God? I mean, what is it about David's heart that makes it a heart after God's own heart? That's part of what we're going to discover as we really get to know David throughout this series. What made David great-hearted in God's sight? And part of my hope is that all of us, we're going to become great-hearted people over these summer months as we kind of roll up our sleeves and study David's life. But let me give us just a couple things to chew on out the gate of this series as we consider this question of what made David's heart one that was after God's heart. And the first thing is this. I believe that we'll see as we get to know David, that David's heart was characterized by a sense of wild abandon. His heart was characterized by a sense of being fully abandoned to God, wild abandon. For instance, there's a real common line from the Psalms associated with David. In Psalm 9, verse 1, David says, I will praise you, O Lord, with all my heart. I mean, that line occurs again and again. Psalm 86, Psalm 111. See, David had an unguarded passion and heart, and he just never held it back from God. He wasn't calculating and cautious with his heart. He was generous and free. There's this one episode where the Ark of the Covenant, which kind of represented God's presence and power for Israel, it was being brought back to Jerusalem. And that moment kind of symbolized or expressed the fact that God was present and reigning with his people. And when that happened, the Bible says, and you think about what this means, what this would look like. When that happened, David, the king of the country, was dancing and leaping with joy before the Lord and before everybody else with all his might. You know, last weekend I was in Tennessee where I grew up and my dad still lives. And I was there to see my dad a little bit and attend a wedding together with him. And this was actually the first wedding that my dad and I went together that neither he nor I were officiating the wedding. That had never happened before. But what I noticed throughout the entire weekend was that my dad, he was just always singing or humming some song. Almost always. There was sort of this light-hearted, full-hearted joy that sort of spilled out of him. In fact, we were driving along, coming back from church on last Sunday. And as we're driving back, I had this playlist rolling through my phone, through the car system there. It was kind of softly underneath whatever conversation we had, but there was a lull in the conversation, and a hymn came through on this playlist. And it was a hymn actually that we sing here from time to time. And it was done in a way that we do it here. And my dad, he just started singing that song, like full voice. And he's always had this big voice, but he's singing in the car, just the two of us. I actually ended up turning the volume up because he was drowning it out. And he just kept belting it out, this hymn. And then that one finished, another hymn came on, and he sang that one too. And then another one right after the other. He's just singing this song in the passenger seat here. My dad always seemed to have a song he was singing or humming, not just then, but throughout the whole weekend. There was a kind of joy about his countenance. It spilled out from what was going on in his heart, no doubt. And as I was around all that, I mean, this is just, a simple little goofy thing here, but I thought, it must make God pretty happy. I thought it must make God incredibly happy to see any time that one of his children is so full of joy and life and gratitude that they just have a song in their heart and on their lips. And I just wonder, when was the last time that you were so full of gratitude to God that you just overflowed with joy and gratefulness and expressed it in a song? That you just had to express it with some measure of wild abandon, whatever wild abandon looks like for you, a heart that is on fire with the goodness of God. Well, that was David. He was so passionate about God and the goodness of God, and he celebrated God's presence and God's goodness. Even though his wife in that moment even thought he had embarrassed himself, made a fool of himself before the whole country, she tried to rein him in a bit. And David actually says to her, he says, listen, I'm going to celebrate before the Lord, even if it means I become even more undignified than I was before. I'll be humiliated, he says, in my own eyes and everyone else's eyes, but I'm going to celebrate God. I just love to see David give his heart to God in wild abandon. And we'll see this characteristic about him in several episodes as we study his life. One day in the midst of a peaceful time, he just broke out in prayer to God, and he said, here I am, I'm living in a house of cedar. I'm living in all this comfort, but God dwells in a tent in what was called the tabernacle, And so he says, I'm going to build you a house, God. But one day God's people are being challenged by a pagan giant, and everybody's intimidated and guarded. But David says, I'll fight Goliath for you, God. Because his heart, his passionate heart, was just given to God with reckless abandon. When God had something for him, David was all in. And I just want to have a heart like that. I don't want to go to my grave with a heart that's cold and calculating and protected and safe and really just hardened. I don't want that. And I don't think you do either. So I long to have a heart like that and to be part of a fellowship of hearts like that, a fellowship of passionate hearts. And part of my hope is that this summer, some of you'll actually worship God with more passion than ever before in your life. Some of you will be moved to expressions of gratitude or to tears of joy or maybe sadness or conviction like you've never had before. My hope is that for some of you, you're going to show courage. You're going to see some enemy in this world or your world that's opposed to God in some way, and you'll say, I'll take that on. I'll sign up for this assignment. I'll try using my gifts. I'll try confronting that difficult thing. My prayer for us over these next couple of months is that we just develop hearts that are wildly abandoned to God. Now, another thing about David's heart, it was characterized by deep reflection. David's heart was characterized not just by wild abandon, but by deep reflection. For instance, this is a typical comment from David. It's also one of the Psalms attributed to him, Psalm 139, at the end of it when David says, search me, O God, and know my heart. And this is a rare combination when you think about just these couple of traits here, a passionate action on the one hand and deep reflection on the other. But that was David. Wild abandonment, but deeply reflective. And I'll tell you what I think. I think David's heart was formed in all those years that he was alone with God. I think that's the only explanation for a soul that was so deep that it could write words like, hey, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. You know, David spent so much of his life waiting. When he was a kid, he just tended sheep. And then there's this amazing day when Samuel comes and anoints him king. And you think about this. Imagine the next day. Because, you know, David doesn't just march into Jerusalem after this and sit on a throne. You know, Saul is still there. Samuel has left. He's gone to Ramah. But what does David do the next day? He goes back to the sheep. I mean, just imagine this happening to you. You've just been anointed king of Israel, and there's no one to tell about it except the sheep. Hey, Sammy, Sally, Susie, Stanley, Stuart, all these sheep. I'm the king. Samuel said so. What do you think about that? And all there are just blank stares, just a bunch of bleeding sheep, you know. Not much excitement there. Sure, you're the king, kid. Why are you doing out here with all of us, you know? All those years, he was leading a flock of sheep through the wilderness. They weren't wasted years. He was learning to be alone with God. He was growing real deep. Then there were all those years he hid from Saul. He was on the run. He lived in caves. He ran from one spot to another. Those weren't wasted years either. He was growing real deep with God in solitude and quiet. God was shaping a great heart, a deep heart. And God wants to do that for you if you'll just give him a chance. You know, do you ever get tired of all the noise? You ever get just tired of the noise factor of the world that we live in? Because in part, that's responsible for a whole lot of superficiality. Richard Foster actually wrote that superficiality is the curse of our age. And maybe the primary reason for a lack of depth is the sheer volume of noise and information that we get bombarded with. This is what Henry Nouwen writes. He wrote, solitude molds self-righteous people into gentle, forgiving people who are so deeply convinced of their own great sinfulness and so fully aware of God's even greater mercy that their life itself becomes a ministry. And I want to tell you, gang, that's a hope of mine too for you and me. Now, my hope certainly is that we're involved in a lot of different kinds of ministries, like through our church, that like the ministry of CCC has a broad reach. You know, think of the pantry or our partners in the community that we support and help, or our international partners and helping to start churches and all the activity and fun that happens through our student ministry, or, you know, things like Art Beat for C3 kids, you know, summer kickoffs and food trucks and men's breakfasts and just all of that. The broad reach of the ministries of CCC. But an equal, if not more urgent hope and prayer for all of the different programs that we have is ultimately simply that your life itself becomes a ministry. I think that I can actually make a case that the years when David's heart was most vulnerable to sin was after he kind of reached the top and became king and had everything, because then he no longer had to be alone with God. I want to have a heart that goes deep with and for God. You know, the first Psalm in the Bible, Psalm 1, there's this great image of a tree. The godly man, it says, the godly woman, is like a tree planted by rivers of water, which yields its fruit in season and whose leaf does not wither. It's where your roots go so deep into the nourishment of God's presence in your life, and your connection with him is so strong that you just flourish. Your life becomes a ministry. And part of what this means is that you and I will have to really guard regular, unhurried times alone with God. We'll have to prioritize it and protect that. We'll have to arrange for it. Think of how we would be different if everybody in our church had what David did. Time to be shepherded by God through his word. David had a heart that was characterized by wild abandon. And I want a heart like that. And he had a heart that was characterized by real deep reflection. And I want a heart like that. But I think one other thing that cries out about David's heart, it's maybe what I want most of all, because David's heart was characterized right down to the core by stubborn love. The most amazing stubborn love. In Psalm 78, verse 72, it says about David that he shepherded the people. He shepherded them with integrity of heart. And the idea here is that it was an undivided heart. It was the opposite of fickle. He loved people with the loyal heart of a shepherd who just keeps loving the sheep, even when the sheep are obstinate, even when the sheep are difficult. Think about some of the people in David's life. There's old Saul, once a promising young king himself, and then just increasingly corrupt and tormented by pathological jealousy of David. Saul, who's tormented by this jealousy of David, constantly deceiving David, several times trying to kill David. And what's most amazing is how, through it all, David kept loving Saul. Twice David could have killed Saul, and he probably would have been justified, but he refused to do it. And he expressed his loyalty back to Saul. And when Saul finally did die, David wrote one of the most beautiful poems ever written to lament for him. How the mighty have fallen, he says. Some of you may have heard that line before, and that's where it comes from. It comes from the Bible. It comes from David. How the mighty have fallen in battle. O daughters of Israel, weep for Saul. How could David find tears for a man like that? He knew all about Saul's faults, better than anybody. And he knew about Saul's possibilities, and he loved him to the end. Then there's Jonathan. Jonathan was Saul's son, and Jonathan would have been his main rival for the throne. One would expect that they would be at each other's throats. They were kind of set up for that. But they had one of the greatest friendships in history. And when they had to be separated, the Bible says they wept together. But David wept the most. And many, many years later, when Saul and Jonathan had both been gone for a while, David said, listen, is there anyone left in the house of Saul to whom I could show kindness for Jonathan's sake? And the people brought before him a son of Jonathan, a kid named Mephibosheth, who was crippled in both feet. And Mephibosheth, when they brought him before the king, he was scared to death. He bowed before David expecting the worst because he kind of could have been seen as a rival and had his own claim to the throne. And so he was expecting to be exiled or more likely killed. And David looks at this powerless, disabled kid, and David says, don't be afraid, Mephibosheth. I just want to love you. I just want to bless you. I want to give you back all the land that belonged to your grandfather. And I want you to eat at my table, he says. I want you to be like my son. And Mephibosheth, he says to David, he says, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? That's what he said. And David wouldn't have any of that kind of talk. He said, nope, you'll be like a son to me from here on out. Then there's his own son, Absalom, a renegade rebel. Absalom tried to overthrow his own father and take the throne. And in the end, Absalom was defeated and he was killed in battle. And David got word that his forces had been victorious and his throne was secure and he would live and he would reign. But his only response was to mourn for his boy. Oh, Absalom, Absalom, he said, my son, if only I had died instead of you. What a heart. When David loved you, you stayed loved because there was a grace and love in his heart for the most stubborn person. And I want to love like that. I thought of my kids as I was pulling all this together. And I thought of my life. And I thought of my friends. I thought of some of you. I thought of some folks I know. There's so many people I cross paths with. And if I could get to the end of my life and have them say about me, and he loved with a stubborn love, and he had grace and love in his heart for even real difficult people. And when he loved somebody, when David loved somebody, they stayed loved. If I could get to the end of my life and have that said about me, I think I'd be a success in God's eyes, no matter what else I do or don't do. And if it can't be said of me, no matter what else I do, I think I'd fail. I want a heart that loves with stubborn love. Lynn Anderson, he writes about David and he points out that maybe the most stubborn of all was his stubborn love for God. He writes these wonderful words at the end of his most famous psalm, Psalm 23, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Maybe David was an old man when he said those words. Maybe he had a long gray beard and a wrinkled face. Maybe he remembered when he was young and handsome and that strange old man, Samuel, poured oil over him and said those mysterious words that started it all. Maybe he remembered how on that day, so long ago, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. Maybe he remembered how he decided when he was a young man, the way that young men do, that when he was king, things would be different. He'd get things right. And sometimes he did, and sometimes he didn't. A lot of times he didn't. A lot of times he got a lot of stuff wrong. But he loved God with his stubborn love, and something inside of him said, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I will be with the Lord forever. He just had this stubborn love, and most stubborn of all was his love for God. And as I was thinking, I thought about David. What if God were to say that to us? What if God were to say, this is a people after my own heart. They followed me with reckless abandon, and they worshiped me from the depths of their heart, and they loved me with a stubborn love. What if God were to say that to all of us? Well, that'd be the best. That'd be the best of all.
We're going to spend some time remembering what Jesus has done for us by celebrating communion. Go ahead and grab some bread and juice so that you can fully participate. We eat a piece of bread and remember that Jesus gave himself up for us, and we drink some juice to remember that his blood was shed on the cross. It's because of Jesus and his sacrifice that we're forgiven and made right with God. It's not that any of us are deserving or worthy of what Jesus has done. It's God's incredible love for each of us that compelled Jesus to offer himself, to make right all the things we've ever made wrong. Let's take a few moments to reflect on God's love for each of us and celebrate communion.
Worthy of every song we could ever sing, worthy of all the praise we could ever bring, worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. We live for you. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder and show me who you are, and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. We live for you. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder and show me who you are, and fill I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation. I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder and show me who you are, and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. And I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation, and I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken.
Thanks again for spending some time with CCC Online. I really hope this online service is exactly what you needed today. If you'd like to visit CCC for an in-person service, check out communitycc.net and click the Plan a Visit button right there on the homepage. If you'd like to contribute financially towards helping people find their way back to God, you can do that on the Give page at CCC's website or by texting CCC White Marsh to the number that's on the screen. They're both safe, secure ways to give. Thanks so much for your continued support and generosity. It really makes a difference and allows CCC to continue serving so many people. So thank you. Don't forget that next week is the big summer kickoff during and after each in-person service. There's going to be a bunch of food trucks, some inflatables for the kids, and a big old tent so you don't have to sit in the sun. Grab some friends, come on out. It's going to be a great time. Say hi on social media. We'll see you right back here next week. Have a great week, everybody.